Otto Warmbier was a 21-year-old American college student from Ohio who traveled to North Korea in late 2015 as part of a guided tour. Warmbier joined a Young Pioneer Tours group, a China-based travel agency advertising trips to North Korea as safe and adventurous. On New Year's Eve 2015, he and other tourists celebrated in Pyongyang's Kim Il-sung Square and later returned to their hotel, the Yanggakdo International Hotel. In the early hours of January 1st, 2016, North Korean authorities alleged that Warmbier attempted to steal a propaganda poster from a restricted staff-only area of the hotel as a trophy. Notably, it remains an open question whether the person who actually committed this act was Otto, or if it was another member of his party. The next day, January 2nd, Warmbier was detained at Pyongyang's airport, just before he could board a flight home. A British tour member witnessed North Korean agents approach Warmbier calmly and escort him away without resistance. North Korea's state news agency announced that an American had been arrested for a hostile act against the state, though details were initially withheld. Warmbier's tour group departed without him, and he disappeared into the nightmare that is North Korean custody. For several weeks there was silence about Warmbier's fate. Then, on February 29, 2016, North Korean authorities produced Warmbier for a staged press conference in Pyongyang. With head bowed, he tearfully quote-unquote confessed to severe crimes against the North Korean state. Reading from a prepared statement, Warmbier said he tried to take the poster on behalf of a church. He claimed the church was working at the behest of the American government, and the purpose was to harm North Korea's work ethic. Observers suspected this extremely odd confession to this bizarre offense was coerced by torture, noting he appeared to speak under obvious duress. Further, they also noted he used language in the confession which was in line with the ideology of North Korea, which is, to put it mildly, not the typical language of an American college student. Nonetheless, the regime pressed forward. On March 16, 2016, North Korea's Supreme Court held a one-hour trial, convicting Warmbier of subversion. He was found to be acting as an American agent undermining the regime. Evidence presented included the forced confession, but that wasn't the end of it. Other evidence included CCTV footage, purportedly showing a figure removing a wall poster, fingerprint evidence, and a hotel staff witness. Notably, it's not even clear whether it was Otto himself removing the wall poster. Warmbier himself begged for forgiveness, calling the incident, quote, "the worst mistake of my life." The court sentenced him to 15 years of hard labor in a North Korean prison, a punishment the U.S. State Department denounced as politically motivated and excessively harsh. International observers widely described the proceeding as a kangaroo court, lacking any semblance of due process. But then things took a turn for the tragic, and things would go from bad to worse for this young man abroad. In April 2016, roughly 1 month into his prison term, Warmbier reportedly suffered a severe neurological injury and fell into a coma. Disturbingly, North Korean officials didn't disclose this to the outside world for over a year. During his captivity, no American or international diplomats were allowed to see him. Sweden, which serves as the protecting power for U.S. interests in North Korea, was repeatedly denied consular access. North Korea finally broke the silence in June 2017, claiming that shortly after Warmbier's trial, he had contracted botulism and slipped into a coma after taking a sleeping pill. According to accounts relayed by North Korean officials to the United States, Warmbier had been treated at Pyongyang's Friendship Hospital while in a vegetative state. Medical records turned over by North Korea indicated he had been comatose since April 2016. According to the North Korean regime, the state insisted they kept him alive through diligent care and were now considering releasing him on, quote, humanitarian grounds. In their words, the North Koreans had selflessly sacrificed their resources to keep an American subversive alive, a take that outsiders found to be unhinged. In May 2017, as a new U.S. administration took office, secret talks between American and North Korean envoys opened a door. In early June 2017, the U.S. State Department learned of Warmbier's grave medical condition during a meeting with North Korean representatives in New York. Upon hearing that Warmbier was comatose, President Trump directed officials to take all necessary measures to bring the young man home. On June 12, 2017, U.S. State Department Special Envoy Joseph Yun flew to Pyongyang with a medical team to negotiate Warmbier's evacuation. Yun was permitted a visit to the hospital, the first time any American had seen Otto in 17 months, and he demanded Warmbier's immediate release, to which North Korea agreed. On June 13, 2017, Otto Warmbier was flown out of North Korea. He arrived in his home state of Ohio that evening, carried off the plane pale and unresponsive, with a feeding tube and breathing apparatus in place. Doctors at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, who quickly assumed his care, described his condition as a state of unresponsive wakefulness, or persistent vegetative state. Warmbier could breathe on his own and occasionally blink, but he showed no signs of awareness or purposeful response. Brain scans provided by North Korea, dated April and July 2016, revealed extensive brain tissue loss, consistent with a prolonged period of oxygen deprivation to the brain. The lead doctor noted that Warmbier's injury likely resulted from a cardiopulmonary arrest. In other words, his heart or lungs had stopped for a period, causing catastrophic brain damage. Importantly, the medical team found no evidence of a botulism infection in his system at any point, directly contradicting North Korea's story of events. Curiously, Otto's body was fairly well nourished, and there were no healed fractures or external marks of trauma, according to the examining physicians. Tragically, Otto Warmbier never regained consciousness, and just 6 days after coming home, on the afternoon of June 19, 2017, he died in hospital. He was just 22 years old and cut down in the prime of his life. News of his death sent shockwaves through the United States. Both Republicans and Democrats were willing to put aside their differences to condemn the North Korean state for the cruel acts committed against Otto. North Korea, for its part, emphatically denied wrongdoing, and you'll never guess what they did next. The regime's foreign ministry called itself, quote, the biggest victim in the incident, claiming that Warmbier's death was a complete mystery to them. Pyongyang's officials insisted that they had treated Otto with the best care in the world. In the wake of Warmbier's death, the United States banned its citizens from traveling to North Korea as of September 2017, citing the serious risk of detention and mistreatment. In late 2018, a U.S. federal court, hearing a wrongful death lawsuit filed by the Warmbiers, found North Korea liable for Otto's imprisonment, torture, and death. Notably, this was issued by way of a default judgment, which in essence means that the North Korean state didn't reply to the lawsuit. Otto Warmbier's case left haunting questions that remain unresolved. Multiple theories have been floated about what really happened to Warmbier during those lost 17 months in North Korea. North Korean officials maintain that botulism was to blame, that he fell ill from contaminated food, took a sleeping pill, and never woke up. However, U.S. doctors found no traces of botulism toxin in his system, and many medical experts believe such a scenario is unlikely, if not impossible, given the evidence. Some neurologists cautioned that botulism could technically not be entirely ruled out due to the long delay in Otto's return, but no concrete proof of it was ever found. Warmbier's parents firmly believe he was brutally beaten and tortured into a coma by his captors. Fred Warmbier has publicly and repeatedly reminded the world that Otto was tortured beyond belief by the North Korean regime. Notably, some have denied that Otto was tortured on the basis that when he returned stateside, he had no signs of healed fractures or external trauma. To interject on a personal level here, I find this position extremely questionable to say the least. The North Korean regime has no regard for the life of its own citizens, and routinely quote-unquote re-educates them. I suspect that the North Korean state employs some bad men familiar with the ways of torture. It's possible that if abuse occurred, it may have been in the form of prolonged sleep deprivation, psychological stress, or asphyxiation methods that left no obvious marks. In the end, every explanation remains frustratingly incomplete. What is clear is that Otto Warmbier entered North Korea a healthy, curious university student eager for adventure, and he left it broken beyond repair. The exact chain of events that led to his coma and eventual death may never be fully known. That said, his family needs closure, so I would hope that the North Koreans come clean as to what actually happened to him. And while I realize this may sound like a crazy concept, the North Koreans have previously withheld information on what really happened to prisoners as a diplomatic bargaining chip. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to take a moment to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Also, if you didn't know, I also have two other channels, Lazy Chill History and Lazy Chill True Crime. These channels revolve around historical content and resolve true crime cases respectively, so check them out after you're done here. In early 2025, nearly 60 years after Dorothy Vaillancourt disappeared, authorities finally put a name to a mystery that had haunted Northern California for decades. A set of unidentified remains found on a hillside in 1966 was positively identified as Dorothy, an Australian-born mother of 7. For decades, she was known only as the Marin County Jane Doe, but advancements in forensic DNA technology eventually cracked the case and brought partial closure to her family. Despite this, another question now looms. What happened to Dorothy and why? On December 18, 1966, a local hunter made a grim discovery near the end of Paradise Drive in Tiburon, California. He stumbled upon the body of a woman at the bottom of a brush-covered cliffside, about 20 feet down the hill from the roadside. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, and the coroner later estimated that the woman had been dead for approximately 2 months. The woman appeared to be middle-aged, roughly between 40 and 60 years old, standing about 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing around 105 pounds. Due to the condition of the body, authorities could not immediately determine how she had died. No obvious cause of death could be established from the remains. It was clear, however, that this woman had died alone on a quiet Marin County hillside, and that no one had reported her missing. Investigators with the Marin County Sheriff's Office began working to identify the unknown woman. In the 1960s, tools like DNA profiling and nationwide databases didn't exist, so detectives relied on traditional methods. They checked missing persons reports, sent out bulletins across California, and scoured local leads. There was speculation that she might have been a patient who wandered away from a San Francisco psychiatric hospital or a traveler who had stayed at a nearby motel. Each lead, however, led nowhere, and the woman's identity remained a mystery. A crucial clue emerged a few days after the body's discovery. A Tiburon fireman came forward on December 21, 1966, to report an encounter he had remembered from 3 months prior. He told the sheriff's investigators that back in the late summer or early fall, a woman matching the Jane Doe's description had showed up at the local fire station. The woman had told the fireman she was stranded and didn't have money for a taxi ride. She asked if she could spend the night at the fire station or even borrow the firefighter's car, but he refused both requests and didn't take any further action. The fireman last saw her walking away down to Barron Boulevard in September 1966. This witness account strongly suggested that the unidentified woman found in December was the same person, meaning she had been alive and in distress a few months before her death. Despite this lead, investigators still did not know her name. With no identification and no immediate matches to missing persons, the case went cold. After the initial flurry of investigation in the late 1960s, the Marin County Jane Doe case lingered on the shelves of cold case detectives. The unknown woman was buried in an unmarked grave at Mount Tamalpais Cemetery in San Rafael, California, and for years her tombstone bore no name. All the while, Dorothy Vaillancourt's family was suffering, not knowing what became of her. Dorothy's 7 children had been separated from their mother in the mid-1960s. In fact, her family spent years actively searching for her, never imagining that the unidentified Jane Doe in Marin County was their missing mother. Dorothy's daughter, Penelope Vaillancourt, who was a teenager when her mother vanished, never gave up trying to find answers. She would ride buses through San Francisco, scanning the faces in the streets for a glimpse of her mother's familiar features. The family reached out to agencies like the FBI and local cold case units, and even checked cemeteries for unidentified graves, hoping for any clue to Dorothy's fate. At one point, Penelope even visited the Australian consulate in San Francisco, thinking her mother might have tried to return to her homeland. Her children suspected that Dorothy's disappearance might be tied to a man in her life, and without evidence of her death, they had little closure. The cold case of Marin County's Jane Doe finally saw progress in the 21st century thanks to forensic genealogy. In 2022, the California Department of Justice and the Marin County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram to re-examine the evidence from the 1966 case. Othram was conducting a special program to tackle unsolved cases with no other leads, and the Marin case was a prime candidate. Using a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing, Othram's scientists were able to extract a comprehensive DNA profile from the decades-old remains. Once Othram had a DNA profile, their in-house forensic genealogists compared it against public genetic databases to find relatives. This painstaking family tree research eventually led to a break in late 2024. A set of genetic matches pointed to relatives of the unidentified woman. By reconstructing the family lineage, investigators homed in on a particular family with ties to Australia. In early 2025, Marin County Sheriff's officials contacted surviving family members of a long-lost woman and obtained DNA reference samples from them. These samples confirmed what the genealogy strongly suggested. The Marin County Jane Doe was Dorothy. The identification was formally announced on March 20th, 2025, ending the nearly 59-year mystery of the Jane Doe's name. Identifying the remains as Dorothy Vaillancourt also shed light on the life story behind the victim. She had been born Dorothy Jean Williams in 1917 in Hobart, Tasmania, an island state of Australia. She grew up in Tasmania and trained as a nurse, and during World War II, Dorothy was working at a Sydney hospital when she met a young American serviceman, François Vaillancourt. François, an American of French-Canadian descent who went by Frank, was a U.S. Marine who had served in the Pacific Theater. The couple married during the war, and after 1945, Dorothy left Australia to begin a new life with her husband in North America. They briefly stayed in François' hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts, then moved west to San Francisco, California, to settle down. In San Francisco, the Vaillancourts built a family, and François worked as a house painter, and Dorothy continued her nursing career in the city. They had 7 children together, and were initially a happy family. However, the good times weren't destined to last. The strain of raising a large family and personal issues took a toll on the marriage. The Vaillancourts eventually divorced in the early 1960s, and Dorothy struggled in the aftermath. She developed a serious alcohol problem and had difficulty holding down a job. Child welfare authorities became concerned about the children's care. Ultimately, the 7 kids were placed in group homes in the San Francisco area during the mid-1960s. Around this time, Dorothy became involved with a new man, one who would later factor into theories about her fate. She met a German immigrant named Hermann Julius Hess and remarried in June 1964. The pair bought a house in Fairfax, a town in Marin County north of San Francisco. At first, it may have seemed like a fresh start for Dorothy, but her new German husband had a dark side. He claimed to have been a figure of authority in the Third Reich, a claim that appears to have likely been made up to instill fear in Dorothy. Whether this was true or not, what was definitely true is that Hess had a violent temper. Penelope and her siblings later described disturbing incidents. In one confrontation, Hess punched 14-year-old Penelope in the face. When her brother intervened, Hess violently attacked the brother and tried to strangle Penelope until the police were called. In the wake of that incident, Hess was arrested. However, the records of this incident now appear to be lost to time. After Hess's arrest, the children, who had briefly been reunited with their mother, were removed from the home in Fairfax. Some of the children went back to live with their father, Frank, but others were sent to orphanages or foster homes. Dorothy remained with Hess in Marin County after the children were gone. By late 1965, Dorothy and Hess were struggling financially. They were court-ordered to sell their Fairfax home to cover debts. The historical record becomes spotty after that, but it appears that at some point in 1966, Dorothy and Hermann Hess separated or fell out of touch. Dorothy, battling alcoholism and having lost her stable home, essentially became transient. The last known sighting of her while alive was the encounter at the fire station in the fall of 1966. With Dorothy Vaillancourt's identity now established, the focus turns to how she died and what led to her body being left on that steep Tiburon slope. Unfortunately, this aspect of the case remains unsolved. Back in 1966, the coroner could not determine a cause of death due to the decomposition and lack of obvious injuries. All that could be said was that she likely died around October 1966, roughly 2 months before discovery, and that her death was not immediately attributable to any cause. Whether Dorothy's demise was the result of foul play, an accident, or some other misfortune is still unknown. The Marin County Sheriff's Office has not publicly stated whether they have reopened a criminal investigation now that Dorothy has been identified. As of the identification in 2025, officials simply acknowledged that the manner of her death is unclear and still under investigation. Several theories have emerged as to what happened to her. One theory points to Hermann Hess, Dorothy's second husband, as a possible culprit. Given Hess's documented violence toward Dorothy and her children, some of Dorothy's surviving family members believe he may have had something to do with her death. Perhaps, they speculate, Hess and Dorothy met one last time in 1966, and an altercation occurred that resulted in Dorothy's death. Supporting this theory is Hess's behavior and the timing. Dorothy vanished not long after separating from him. However, Hermann Hess himself is, with certainty, deceased, given that he was born in 1911. If Hess did harm Dorothy, he cannot be brought to justice now, but confirming his involvement would at least answer the family's lingering questions. Another theory is that Dorothy's death could have been a tragic accident or the result of exposure. It's possible that on the night she died, Dorothy was walking alone along the quiet road, perhaps under the influence. In her vulnerable state, she could have stumbled into danger. A hit-and-run incident is one potential scenario. A driver may have hit her and then, in a panic, tossed her body down the embankment to cover up what had happened. Alternatively, Dorothy might have simply lost her footing on the edge of the road and fallen down the slope, succumbing to injuries or exposure without anyone around to help. Another theory focuses on the somewhat odd actions of the firefighter who had seen her a few months prior to her discovery. This theory is entirely speculative, but as the last known person to have seen her alive, some have placed suspicion on him. It's unknown what investigative steps were taken with respect to him at the time Dorothy was discovered, and it's unknown whether he's still alive. Still another theory suggests that Dorothy may have intentionally went off the embankment in a successful effort to end it all. The evidence to support this is entirely circumstantial. However, Dorothy had essentially lost everything. Her family had been taken away from her, and her second marriage, albeit to an absolute monster, had just collapsed. Further, she was suffering from substance use issues, which may have compounded her existing problems. I hope to have an update on what happened to Dorothy in a future episode.